Hello, Fiendlings, how the hell are you? I don't have too many updates other than to tell you that Extinction is well over 70,000 words now, and I have more or less finished the second act of the book, which of course means I'm now on Act 3. I still haven't started writing Act 1, although I have dozens of scenes in my head and a few even written down. I guess part of the reason for that is that I need to know how the book ends so I know how it needs to begin. Confused? Good. So am I. Quick reminder for you folks, the Black audiobook, narrated by Joe Hempel, is now available up at Audible, iTunes, and Amazon. If you want to support the podcast and my work, consider spending that Audible credit and enjoy the revised version of The Black, with a true pro of a narrator. That said, it's time for me to get out of here and get back to writing Act 3 of Extinction. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 18 of Station 3. Chapter 27. The dock they'd landed in had been more or less in the station's middle. That meant they had at least 3 modules above and below. It was impossible to know if the modules had been combined into one large space or if they were truly separate levels. Reactors were always located at the bottom of structures because no one wanted a runaway nuclear reactor melting down and burning through an entire facility. Reki had told him to destroy Station 3, meaning he'd have to descend unless he managed to find a convenient lever marked "blow this fucker up" on this level. Zulf walked carefully down the corridor and as close to the bulkhead as he dared. He could practically feel tendrils of this shit trying to grasp his suit, but knew that was impossible. That stuff couldn't get through his armor, and considering his mass, it wouldn't be able to hold him. It would take an enormous amount of the stuff for that to happen. With the first open vent no more than a meter away, he shined his lights upward and illuminated the open space. The same material on the bulkheads choked what he could see of the HVAC duct, a few threaded tendrils waving lazily in the air. If he had more plasma fuel, he'd send a blast up there just to see how fast it burned. Then again, that might start a chain reaction through the ducts and cause an explosion. Would that really be so bad? He continued forward, plasma torch still aimed at the ceiling, eyes flicking between the vent and the hatch on the bulkhead with each step. "Let me know if something moves," he said through the suit speakers. "Yeah," Demotier called back. "Movement, yeah." After taking a deep breath, Zulf reached for the hatch and pressed against the blanket of gunk where the stud should be. Nothing happened apart from tiny tendrils snaking out and entwining around his fingers. Sighing, he pushed the plasma torch's teardrop pilot light to the material. The blue flame contacted the gunk, and it immediately caught fire like a spider's web. The bulkhead sighed as the flora, or whatever it was, moved away from the burning torch. Zulf continued dragging the tool downward until he uncovered the hatch stud. Grinning, he touched it, and the hatch opened. The grin disappeared at once. The well-lit room had 3 vents, 2 closed, and the alien gunk covered every surface. That, however, was not what had wiped the smile from his face. As with the locker room on Station 2, several giant piles that looked like greenish dung sat in the middle of the room. Eggs? Zulf cursed himself for the thought. The open vent stared down from the ceiling, the stalactites of goop hanging from its corners. Vents, dung piles. What the fuck was going on here? It was impossible to know what the room had originally been. He didn't see any supplies or even shelves. A storage room that had been looted, perhaps? Maybe. He stepped out of the room and closed the hatch. "What was in there?" Demotier asked. "Nothing you want to see," Zulf said. He peered at the vent above him, daring something to move, but only the lazy tendrils showed signs of life. He carefully walked to the opposite bulkhead, pressed the torch against the thick blanket of gunk, and uncovered the stud. "Can you burn all of that shit?" Demotier asked. "Only if I want to waste all of my fuel," Zulf said. "How much do you have left?" Zulf ignored him and pressed the stud, his wrench held in a blocking position, tool arm pointed directly at the hatch. It opened wide into a room identical to the last, although the lights in here didn't function. Zulf panned his suit lights around the room and froze. The room had the same piles as the last, but they rippled as though alive. He stepped backward, slammed his fist against the stud, and turned to Demotier. "To me! Now!" he yelled. The suitless engineer blinked at him in confusion. Then they heard an inhuman shriek from inside the closed room, and Demotier's brain unfroze. He ran at Zulf, his eyes wide as saucers and mouth gibbering nonsense. Zilf waited for the man to pass him before turning and following. The things inside the room had started banging on the hatch, and any second now, they'd either find a way to open it or maybe come crashing through. The pair made it 2 meters before Zilf heard booms above them, the sound of metal ductwork flexing beneath a lot of mass. He opened his mouth to tell Demotier to stop, but before he could, the man crossed an open vent. 3 insectile limbs dropped down, the first grabbing his chin with long fingers, another sliding sideways before perforating the man's chest. Demotier screamed for an instant before the third limb slashed through his skull, cleanly cleaving it in half. The arms pulled upward out of sight and spirited their prize into the ducts. Zilf activated his torch and fired a gout of superheated plasma into the open vent. A shriek of pain echoed throughout the corridor, much louder than Zilf had thought possible. By the time the echo faded away, he heard another scream further away, and another, and another. "Fuck me," Zilf panted. Were the creatures calling to one another, maybe giving away his position? Were they sharing the meal that had just been nabbed from the corridor, or were they warning one another? A scream of rage and fury echoed through the ducts like doom. Whatever creature had made that sound, he could already hear it in the HVAC system, and it sounded massive. Another boom, and he knew exactly where it was. It was coming to his vent. Zilf ran down the corridor, hugging the bulkhead, the muck reaching for him with its tiny tendrils, both torch and wrench held above his head, aimed at nothing. The deck vibrated, and he glanced at his rear cam. Something had joined him in the corridor. Zilf didn't slow. An arm reached down for one of the vents ahead of him, and Zilf ran straight at it, his wrench swinging. The metal bar smashed into the muscular arm and snapped it in half at the third joint. The amputated limb smacked into the bulkhead and practically disappeared into the growth. The shrieks through the ducts compounded, the noise becoming a keening collection of sounds that hurt his mind. Behind him, a creature at least 3 meters long and a meter high closed on him, its 6 multi-jointed legs giving it an awkward yet terrifyingly speedy gait. He had maybe another 20 meters before he'd have to deal with it. Up ahead, the corridor branched off in opposite directions. The growth covered any luma paint or signs that might have told him which way to go. Trusting to luck, Zilf chose the left branch and ran as fast as he could, his servos whining, the deck vibrating beneath his boots from both his pace and the thing behind him. The branch led to a half-moon-shaped tunnel, vents spaced every 5 meters. Some 20 meters ahead, he saw a suit rack, tool racks, and most importantly, a lift. He wasn't going to make that 20 meters. Zilf stepped sideways and began a wide turn, his plasma torch's focus set as narrow as possible with the power amped to full. The creature, green goo spraying from its mouth as it galloped toward him, didn't slow, its cluster of black eyes boring into him with alien disinterest. Or maybe hunger. 5 meters. Zilf raised the torch, aimed directly at the thing's head, and fired. A pencil-thin line of blue fire spat from the torch and met the creature in its eye cluster. Even with the creature's screams, its sliding limbs and the liquid gurgle bubbling in its throat, he heard the sounds of eyes exploding like firecrackers. The right side of the thing's face erupted into flame as the beam cut through the soft flesh and instantly boiled the liquid inside. The creature tried to sidestep while at a full gallop, one of its legs kicking his calf. Before it fully passed him, Zilf spun, knelt, and swung all at the same time. The wrench whistled through the air, servos screaming, and smashed into the creature's rear legs. The multi-jointed limbs crunched, one snapping near the creature's abdomen, while the other dangled useless, bent and broken. It shrieked again and started to turn, its damaged rear legs keeping its ass end dragging the deck. Zilf didn't give it a chance to make the turn. He crouch ran as fast as he could, the wrench smashing the middle pair of legs before he raised it and pummeled the creature's back. If the thing had a spine, it sounded as if it had shattered. The thing rolled over on its side, tumbled, and righted itself, ass end still facing Zilf. He walked to the creature, which now sounded like a strangling child, and kicked it over so the head faced him, the circular maw vibrating and snapping. Zilf didn't say anything, didn't think anything. He swung the wrench again and met the creature full in the skull. A loud crunch echoed off the walls, and the thing's unnervingly human cries ceased. A gout of liquid much thicker than human blood geysered from the massive divot in what remained of the creature's head. Zilf turned and faced the corridor, expecting another one to come scrambling at him. Instead, there was nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the drip of fluid from the creature's savaged corpse. He glanced upward. No vent. Zilf sighed and waited for his heart to stop jackhammering. Plasma fuel at 7% flashed across his HUD. Another fight or two like that, and he might not have any plasma left. He certainly didn't have enough fuel to make a large cut if he needed one. Bludgeon, smash, and bash were nearly the only options remaining. "When you got nothing left," his instructor at the academy had said, "you still got the suit. As long as it's functional, it's a weapon. As long as you're driving it, you are a weapon." Zilf readjusted his grip on the wrench and steadied its end. A layer of slimy goop dripped from the tool. He shook the wrench and the gore mostly dropped off. The crap didn't diminish the tool's effectiveness, but Zilf liked his tools clean. "You are ridiculous," he heard his father's ghostly voice say. "Being chased by demons and you're worried about your tool being clean?" Zilf chuckled. It was stupid and juvenile. Still, clean tools made him happy. He didn't think he'd be happy for long. Once certain nothing else was coming for him, he surveyed the storage area. The suit racks were empty, as were most of the tool racks. The only supplies remaining included emergency light arrays, 3 portable welders and fuel, 2 bolt guns, a spare wrench, and a steel cutter. The suit racks could only hold 9 prefabbed refinery-level models, meaning that if Station 3 had real EETs, the loadouts and supplies must be on another level. Not good. A small cubicle standing on the left bulkhead blinked at him with a friendly blue. Atmo Energy Station. Zilf walked to it, attached the lead to his suit, and watched his HUD. His suit's atmosphere levels had been at 60%, but quickly rose. Same with the suit's power levels. At least he'd have plenty of power and air. Weapons, on the other hand. The HUD announced his suit had 100% energy and air. Zilf disconnected the lead, and it automatically retracted into the cubicle. He silently thanked Allah for providing something, or rather several somethings, he could maybe use as weapons. Maybe. A shriek sounded in the distance, followed by several more. The creatures were talking again, probably plotting and planning. He needed to get the fuck out of here. Zilf clomped to the tool rack, grabbed the spare wrench, and maglocked it to his inner tool arm. The slab of metal immediately snapped in place, strong electromagnets holding it there like an invisible holster. He picked up the large bolt gun, checked the energy levels and ammunition. Plenty of energy, no ammo, as expected. A crate next to the tool rack contained a few rolls of bolts. The 14-centimeter long bolts, their heads sharp enough to perforate metal, and the tips designed to spread and lock once they punctured their target, gleamed at him from their bandoliers. 2. I can carry 2 bandoliers, he thought, mentally calculating the amount of space in his pouch and pack. After grabbing 2 rolls and putting them in his pouch, he grabbed a third and fed it into the gun. The bandolier spun as the gun's loader wrapped it around an internal cylinder. Once the bandolier completely disappeared, the indicator on the gun read 10 in friendly green. 10 shots per bandolier, 30 total. Better than nothing, but he'd literally kill for more plasma fuel. Zilf examined the metal cutter. It had a full charge, and while it would be a clumsy weapon to wield, the diamond blade would make short work of flesh. With one of these, he could cut a relatively thin plate of steel in seconds. If he could bear down on one of the creatures with the tool, he'd slice and dice it nearly instantly. He stared at the wrench still in his hands before slotting it back in its place. 2 wrenches, a bolt gun, and a metal cutter. And a bit of plasma fuel, he muttered. Zilf pulled the cutter from its place on the rack and held it easily in one hand. Aiming it and operating it would require both arms, but if nothing else, it would serve as a larger blocker than his wrench. In theory. Zilf went over his inventory and decided he had room for 2 of the welding fuel canisters. Useless for his tools, but they were flammable, and the creatures didn't seem to like fire. He could make that work. After taking one last long look down the corridor and shivering at the shrieks still echoing through the ducts, he strode to the lift, tapped the stud, and walked inside. The security system demanded his credentials. He activated his hacks and quickly overrode the system. The dock had been heavily secured, but once inside, it seemed he'd be able to access any lift or hatch he needed. The lift's holo display came to life. According to the schematic, he was on level 4 of 10. 6 levels down, a reactor core awaited his sabotage. Zilf tapped the 10 button and waited for the lift to move. It jerked on its tracks and he saw several somethings moving in the corridor. As the lift descended, they approached at terrifying speed. Before they made it to him, the lift was already out of sight. Chapter 28. Zilf heard the sound of metal tearing and cracking. He looked upward and saw what he'd hoped he wouldn't: an access panel. The lift shuddered as something landed atop it, 3 chitinous spikes stabbing through the thin metal panel. He raised the cutter, started the blade, and thrust it upward where the creature had landed. The blade sliced through the metal as if it were tissue paper and caught something a bit fleshier. The thing on top of the lift squealed, and the spikes disappeared from the ceiling, greenish liquid drizzling through the holes. Another thump, and this time the lift's mechanism buckled, the steel cage bucking and grinding. A metallic squeal followed, and a corner of the ceiling ripped away. A face, something that might once have been human, stared at him with 3 black eyes, a long muscular tongue flicking out of its oval mouth and licking the air. He raised the cutter to the corner and shoved upward. The grinding, tearing sound of the blade meeting metal changed to a burring sound as it met the creature's shell. A pained scream echoed through the cage. Then another corner of the ceiling peeled back. They were going to be on top of him in seconds. The lift had passed level 5 and approached level 6. Zilf stabbed his finger through the hollow interface, choosing the number 6. More spikes drove through the ceiling and lifted upward. The lift came to a sudden halt with the rattle and grind of struggling gears and motors. It shook again, and the ceiling buckled in the middle, the metal lowering nearly to his helmet. Zilf didn't wait for the cage to open. Cradling the cutter across his body, he ran forward, forearms bared, and struck the lift's door as hard as he could. It was already beginning to open, but the force of his suit crashing into the grated steel blew the door completely off its track and into the corridor beyond. Zilf ran 3 meters from the lift and whirled. The first creature dropped through the ceiling, a scorpion-like tail flicking behind it, its multifaceted eyes staring at him with that spooky, dead black. It coiled to leap, and Zilf held the cutter in front of him, blade whirring. The creature might have realized its mistake in the air, but Zilf didn't know for sure. Maybe some part of it knew what was about to happen and just didn't care. Regardless, its bulbous skull met the cutter with enough force to knock Zilf backward. The blade ripped through the creature's face and split the skull, gray and green gore splattering across the bulkheads and his visor. The creature's body continued past the blade and slammed into his waist. Surprised, Zilf couldn't activate his magnetics fast enough and fell on his ass with a crash. The twitching creature's tail swung aimlessly, its barbed end snapping like a whip. Zilf kicked the creature away and heard 2 more drop through the lift. He repositioned the cutter, barely noticing the struggling motor or its slightly bent blade, and brandished it like a sword. The next creature looked more like what he and Yuri had fought at Station 2, long, segmented, and bulbous. It coiled tightly and leaped, the creature beside it seemingly awaiting its turn. Before he could reach his feet, the large one was upon him, its limbs wrapping around him, and its horrid alien mouth dropping on his helmet. A proboscis shot from its open maw and slammed into his visor while its teeth vibrated like a machine. The proboscis hit him again, and his HUD flashed warning messages about helmet integrity. 70%. With a yell of effort, Zilf pushed as hard as he could with his forearms and launched the creature 2 meters away. It crashed into the next assailant with a wet thwap. The pair screamed, although whether in pain or frustration, he wasn't sure. Zilf hopped to his feet, the deck vibrating beneath his mass, tossed the cutter away, and pulled the bolt gun. Instead of running away from the creatures that were still trying to untangle themselves, he quickly walked forward, aimed the bolt gun at the large creature's head, and fired. Shattered chitin exploded in the air, shards pattering against the bulkheads and his suit. Before the thing had a chance to shriek, he shot it again, this time at the rigid ring of flesh between segments. The bolt pierced the creature and nearly parted its body. Green liquid poured out of the wound, the creature's keening wail loud enough to ring his ears. The last creature, a multi-legged thing that tried to turn its head toward him, scrabbled with its sharp appendages, desperately attempting to gain purchase. Zilf didn't give it the chance. As the creature finally managed to untangle itself from its mangled brethren, he knelt and placed the bolt against its skull and activated the weapon 3 times. The first bolt yielded an explosion of chitin, the second the sound of shattered bone, the third merely a wet squelch. The creature's head no longer had a shape unless mush was in the realm of geometry. Zilf stomped on both creatures until they were little more than pools of liquid with gobbets of flesh and shards of chitin. He stepped back from the open lift, bolt gun held before him, ready to shoot anything else that decided to drop down. The sound of things moving through the vents caught his ear. As quickly as he dared, he stepped into the lift, tapped the hollow display for floor 2, and quickly stepped back from the mangled lift cage. Gears ground and machinery struggled, but the lift rose. With a little luck, any creatures that tried to get to his floor would fall through the open shaft to their deaths, if he was lucky. Thus far, good fortune didn't seem to be abundant on Zhao. Feeling safe for a moment, he quickly surveyed his surroundings. A short corridor led to a wide circular area with a single hatch. Patches of gunk stained the steel, but they weren't nearly as thick as on level 4. Whatever had happened on level 4 had allowed this stuff to grow unabated. For whatever reason, this level hadn't suffered the same fate. Yet. He picked up the cutter and examined the blade. It was bent, and the end of the cutter where it attached had practically snapped. The tool would never work again. Zulf growled at it before disconnecting the circular blade and slapping it against his forearm. It immediately clamped to the suit via its magnetic field. In disgust, he tossed the cutter tool into the corner where it clattered gracelessly into the bulkhead. He just armed himself and already he was down one tool. Fuck, he thought. At least he'd gotten one of them with it. If these things had once been Station 3 and Station 2 personnel, how many were there? Dozens? Hundreds? It was a question he both did and did not want an answer to. Vents. More vents ran down the corridor every few meters, but were closed. Cocking an eyebrow, Zulf walked carefully to the circular room, keeping as close to the bulkhead as possible. As he approached the hatch, he made out lumipaint beneath the patches of gunk. The word Exolab glowed from the large central hatch, an unsupervised security kiosk standing next to it. Zulf frowned. They had guards to monitor the ingress-egress of workers to and from the lab? With all the tech available, that seemed both too inefficient and archaic for Shenzhou. He'd never heard of such a thing inside one of the classified facilities. Maybe an office building or warehouse, but never a research or refining facility. A crash from above made him flinch, his arm instinctively rising to point at the ceiling. The sound didn't repeat. Zulf pulled his wrench and clenched his fingers tight, the metal feeling reassuring through his glove's tactile sensors. He watched the ceiling for a moment, eyes focused on the nearest vent. After turning his suit lights to full, he shined the powerful headlamp into the vent's closed grate and saw metal staring back at him. He relaxed a little. No gunk in the vent, no creature waiting to drop on him. Nevertheless, he continued skirting the vents as much as possible until he reached the hatch. The guard kiosk next to it still had a cup of coffee in the cup holder, but he didn't see any signs of struggle or an attack. A tablet sat in its cradle, and Zulf pulled it from the slot. The hollow slab came to life and immediately asked for a security token. Another lockout. "We'll fix that," he said, and connected to the interface. The hack took less than a second. The slab's display filled with alarm statuses and security alerts. Zulf quickly ran down the list looking for big-ticket items like nuclear reactors. No such luck. They were nominal. What wasn't nominal was the HVAC system. Levels 10 through 5 reported elevated levels of methane and CO2, levels too high for an unsuited human to last in. Where was that coming from? Had that been what made Demotier cough and his flesh to change color? All levels appeared to have power except level 1. The top level, where the elevator connected to the orbital, was as dead as Yuri. A tap, and it was obvious why. Power conduit failure. Zulf nodded to himself. That was something easily fixed. Shit, if he had to, he could use his suit to complete the circuit long enough to kickstart things. He attempted to find facility schematics on the tablet, but there were none. The tablet also couldn't query the internal systems. Basically, they'd given their guard a neutered computer with neutered information. Lovely, he thought, and tossed the tablet to the floor. Zulf tapped the hatch, and the interface asked for his credentials. It took several attempts to find the right hack, but the suit's computer finally came through for him. A lamp above the threshold turned green, and the hatch opened with a hiss of air. He swung it wide, and an ironic grin touched his face. Airlock. Large enough for 2 clean-room-suited humans, it was barely large enough for him to fit inside, and he still had to bend the slightest bit at the knees. He shut the airlock door and looked through the porthole into the next room. The airlock temperature stood at 4 degrees C, but based on the frost clinging to the glass, he guessed the lab hovered at around 0. The frozen droplets also made it difficult to see. HVAC failure. Did the gunk finally get into the systems and ruin them, or had someone manually shut down the HVAC? Regardless of the temperature, or even the air quality, the good news was that he didn't see anything moving inside. The bad news? The gunk was everywhere. Large patches of the substance had coalesced and jutted out from the bulkheads like mossy tree trunks. The rails, the catwalks, the bulkheads, everything had the stuff. Wherever he walked in there, he'd be stepping on alien flora, or maybe it was fauna. How thick did this stuff have to get before he needed to worry about becoming tangled in it or trapped by it while one of the creatures struggled to get through his armor? The memory of the alien proboscis shooting into his visor made him shiver. Zolf checked the bolt gun, saw he had 5 shots left, and considered reloading. Once ejected, the bandolier was useless, as was any unspent ammo. 5 bolts remaining. A reload would take at least 15 to 20 seconds to load another bandolier for 10 more shots. Deciding he couldn't afford to waste any ammo, he clamped the bolt gun to his back, set his plasma torch to a wider cone, and took a deep breath. If Yuri were here, he'd be asking Zilf if he was waiting for an invitation. No, he said to himself. Just some courage. He could practically hear Yuri's laugh as he touched the stud to start the airlock. A fog of gas filled the airlock. His suit's HUD flashed to warn him he was now inside a toxic environment, and he rolled his eyes. The whole damned station was toxic now, or soon would be. As usual, the only thing keeping him alive was the suit. The fog thickened before unseen fans whirred, and the gas dissipated into the airlock system. The airlock hissed again, and the interface changed from a flashing red to blue. The word "enter" flashed lazily in the air. Zolf touched the stud, and the hatch swung open.